I'm pleased to be with you at Rabina this morning and to be joining in with others online. It's good to be able to contribute to your reflections on Mark's Gospel. It's helpful sometimes to read the whole Gospel in one sitting to get a sense of the broad sweep of the story. In the first half of Mark, people are basically puzzled by Jesus. That's the question that's on their lips time and time again. Who is this? After his first healing miracle, the crowd asks, "What is this? A new teaching with authority. He commands and even the unclean spirits obey him." When Jesus forgives the sins of the paralysed man in chapter 2, the scribes ask, "Why does this fellow speak in this way?" When Jesus calms the sea, the disciples say to one another, "Who is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" When Jesus teaches in the synagogue in his hometown, people ask, "Where did this man get all this? What's this wisdom that's been given to him?" In the first part of Mark, all sorts of people struggle to understand who Jesus is. They don't get his teaching and they don't understand what his healings mean. In some stories, the scribes and the Pharisees don't understand. In other stories, Jesus' own family and his fellow countrymen misunderstand. And in places, Jesus' own disciples don't get him at all. Each of these sequences of failing to understand is followed by a story in which Jesus heals someone. People who were blind come to see. And then comes the hinge that connects the two parts of the gospel. The turning point is in chapter 8, where Jesus asks Peter, "Who do people say I am?" And then, "Who do you say I am?" Peter is the first to say, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." In the first part of Mark, the term Christ doesn't appear at all, except for the title verse at the very beginning. In the second part, Jesus is called Christ, Messiah, several times. In the second part, who Jesus is presented plainly, directly. Jesus teaches the disciples who he is and what it means. The inherited understanding of Messiah as a coercive, powerful political and military leader is turned upside down. Jesus is Christ, he is the Messiah, but he's not a political revolutionary. He's a servant treading the way of the cross. He repeatedly explains what that way means. It will involve being handed over to the chief priests and the scribes, being condemned to death, being mocked, spat upon, flogged, and rising again. At the end of chapter 10, blind Bartimaeus does come to see, to understand, and we're told he immediately follows Jesus on this way. Now, this overall flow of the gospel helps make sense of today's passage. It comes just after the hinge. Jesus has been identified as the Christ, the Messiah, but the disciples have not yet fully understood what that means. Bartimaeus is yet to come to see. The disciples have inklings, but the full implications of the kind of Messiah Jesus is and the way of the cross he will follow haven't yet taken hold of them. The blind and the deaf in the gospel symbolise the disciples. Jesus says to the disciples in chapter 8, "Do you still not perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes and fail to see? Do you have ears and fail to hear?" And when Jesus heals the blind and the deaf, that parallels the disciples coming to faith, coming to see. Do you remember the story in chapter 8 about the blind man that Jesus partially heals and asks him, "Can you see anything?" The man says, "Yes, I can see people, but they look like trees walking." Then Jesus touches his eyes again, and finally he sees clearly. He comes to see in stages. That's just like the disciples coming to understand Jesus. At first they glimpse something of who he is, but their vision is fuzzy. They grasp something of the truth, but they don't quite get it all. Peter sees Jesus is the Messiah, but what kind of Messiah? Peter can't accept that suffering, rejection, and eventually death will be the path this Messiah is to follow. As the second part of Mark unfolds, Jesus teaches openly about what it means for him to be the Messiah and what it means for his disciples to follow him. On 3 different occasions, Jesus teaches about his own coming death and resurrection, and each time the disciples fail to understand and Jesus instructs them. After the 3rd time, blind Bartimaeus is healed. And again, the blind man stands for the disciples. The disciples want to see too. They want to understand who Jesus is and what his mission involves, but they've failed to understand, and what Jesus has tried to teach them now on 3 occasions hasn't got through. Their sight is still fuzzy. That's what's going on in today's passage. The disciples understand that Jesus will begin a new reign, a new kingdom, a new community, but the character of that new community eludes them. When James and John ask for positions of power and authority and privilege and prestige, they don't get it. That's clear. Eventually they will. Finally, by an act of grace, by a gift, they'll be granted sight. And like blind Bartimaeus, when they see truly, they too will follow Jesus on the way of the cross. Chapter 10, verse 45, at the end of today's passage, is a very important but often misunderstood text. The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Very often this verse is used to argue that Jesus was a humble servant who, as John's Gospel tells us, stooped as low as to wash his disciples' feet at the Last Supper. The argument runs that Jesus was prepared to undertake the lowliest menial servant tasks, so we should humbly follow his example. Now it's true, Christians are called to serve others, but that's not really what this text in Mark is about. The point is not that Jesus is a lowly servant who is a model for all Christians to be humble. That's not what's going on here at all. We're led astray by putting the comma in the wrong place. We usually read it like this: the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, comma, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So Jesus' life had 2 purposes: to serve and to die. But why lump them together like that? What's the relationship between these 2 things? But watch what happens if you move the comma and split the verse in a different place. The Son of Man came not to be served, comma, but to serve, to give his life as a ransom for many. Then the force of the sentence is quite different. It's saying that the purpose of Jesus' life was to serve precisely by dying. The service is carried out precisely in his death. The words translated serve here are diakon words. It's where we get our term deacon from. It doesn't mean undertaking lowly menial tasks. It means carrying out a commission given by someone in authority. Jesus is carrying out a personal commission from God. The sense of the verse is that Jesus did not come with attendants and underlings that he could send here and there to do his bidding, to do what he chose. Jesus didn't come to be served, to be a master instructing servants. No, Jesus is the servant doing what the master has instructed. Jesus was sent by God to do God's bidding, to lay down his life for the life of the world. Now, this way of thinking shifts quite dramatically how we understand our own Christian service. Usually we think of Christian service as humbly serving others out of love or concern or benevolence or compassion. But if Jesus' diaconia was to fulfill his commission from God to die for the life of the world, then our diaconia, our service, is not so much about being loving and compassionate to others, undertaking menial tasks. It's more about fulfilling the task that God sends us to do. Of course, we are to be loving and compassionate to others, but that's not the thrust of this text. Diaconia is about being sent by someone in authority with a task to fulfill, doing what the Master requires. In John's Gospel, Jesus says, "As the Father sent me, so I send you." Do we take sufficiently seriously that we are sent people, each of us commissioned by God to fulfill a crucial task? We have a commission. We are directed, instructed to carry out a mission, a task, a duty. The precise shape of the task will be different for each of us. God calls and sends different people to undertake different things. Vocations are personal and diverse. But the responsibility we all share is to clarify what our task is in prayerful conversation with our brothers and sisters, and then to be faithful, intentional, and persevering in fulfilling that task. God's coming kingdom depends on it. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve by giving his life as a ransom for many. May we discern our task and give ourselves fully to it. Amen.